Hi class, this is the video on syntax, truth values, and operators. That is, it's the video that's supposed to more formally introduce you to the content of sections 1.1 and 1.2 of the textbook. Before we do that though, I want to say just a few more general things about um, the expectations in this course and how things go. I think first and foremost, I cannot emphasize enough that I am not that creative in the sense that I'm not going to do weird things and ask you to do stuff that the book doesn't ask you to do or that I've specifically told you I'm going to do. And um, the exams, which are the bulk of the points of this course, will just be asking you to do stuff that you've already done in a more formal, more rigorous setting. So, um, further, there's a slight and unfortunate ambiguity. Maybe I should have used a different word. But you'll notice from the syllabus it talks about two different kinds of exercises. Um, if you look at the weekly due dates, it lists uh, exercises and weekly exercises. That's the distinction. Sorry, it's not the greatest distinction. By exercises, it means the things at the end of each section of the book, or sometimes in the middle. For instance, there's the exercises at the end of 1.2. And in the syllabus, it basically tells you which of those you should do. Um, the best way to think about those exercises is like a required reading in another course. Of course, you have to do it, or at least as much of it as is necessary. Um, but since this isn't, grade school, I'm not going to follow you around making sure you did it. Instead, that is part of your independent job as a student, just like reading the textbook is to do those exercises. As I mentioned in the syllabus, though, what do we mean by do those exercises? Do enough that you could succeed. Assume that you're going to be having to do some very similar things on the exam and on graded material. Do enough of those so that you're practiced and grasp the material firmly enough that you can do so. And um, most of the time, that should be all of them, for reasons I'll mention in a minute. But if you find stuff really, really easy, sure, you can skip it a little. Now, why do I say most of the time? It's usually going to require all of it. As the exercises require a little more effort, and if you want to get into if you want to get into things, you could look at some of, say, the later answers in the back of the textbook. Um, if that's the kind of thing you say, well, I'm sure I could do that if I had some time to do it. Remember, the exams are timed, or I should say, I'm now informing you that the exams are timed, which means you need to not only be able to do the exercises, but be comfortable enough with them that you could do them in a timed setting. And so it's really important that you can do the exercises uh, with enough practice that you're comfortable enough to be able to do it with a timed exam. So just be aware of that. So that's all I expect for the book exercises. And as I mentioned there, do notice that selected answers um, from the textbook are in the back. They're noted by a star. So if you want to look up one or two to make sure you're doing it correctly, feel free. If you're pretty solid on these overall, I always recommend that maybe save the starred ones for the exam review period. The exam review. A great way to review for the exam is just go through all the exercises from the readings, do the starred ones, and look up your answers in the back of the book. It's a great self-test. So those are just how we treat the exercises and that are available to you. Unlike some textbooks, this textbook will sometimes have exercises in the middle of a chapter after it's gone over an important concept to make sure you can do them. So those are listed on the syllabus as things like first exercises. That would be the ones in the middle, and then the second exercises come later. FYI. All right, now what are the weekly exercises? those are the ones that are graded on a weekly basis. They're in some ways summative. I'm asking you to do things that you should be able to do after completing the assigned reading and the exercises in here. So in order, what you should be doing is watching the video to introduce you to these things, read the textbook to give you a more advanced introduction, and then do the exercises in the textbook. After you've done that, you should be in a position to succeed. So you've gotten all of your necessary groundwork in. That's when you should turn to the weekly exercises that are the actually graded ones. And if it wasn't clear enough from what I've just said, notice these lectures are not a replacement for reading the book. They're not intended to be. They're intended to walk you through some of the more important concepts, perhaps using a little different language and maybe some different methods so things might click a little better. But they're absolutely not intended as a replacement for the text. And so when you do to the weekly exercises, you will notice that those are just in each individual unit. I will just about always have them as a posted discussion board. But it's such that your classmates can't see your work until they've posted as well. So you don't have to worry about people copying off of you or anything like that. But the reason I do them on the discussion board is it's just a great way to share ideas as a class, kind of treat each other as a support group, work together. If we were in a normal classroom setting, you'd be working together on problems all the time. And so please use them that way. Please help your colleagues. Please accept help from your colleagues, and everybody will do fine, and it'll be a fun experience. If you really, really, really have like a personal issue about I don't want colleagues to be able to see my work, email me and we'll work something out. But I encourage you to be open to really kind of doing these in a supportive environment that we've set up in the online course. All right, so that's all the preamble about what we're doing with the individual chapters. Let's talk about the specific material from Unit 1 and Unit 2. So, Unit 1.1 really does the groundwork for argument stuff. As I mentioned on the introductory video, if you would like a more advanced introduction to these things that goes through things in more depth but in a casual way, there's those 4 optional videos. If not, here's the key parts from Unit 1 to take away. As Ulrich and Gustason point out, there's really 2 ways an argument can go wrong. I like to think of it in terms of there's 2 things an argument needs to do to go right, too. So every argument must do 2 things. As I mentioned in the previous video, they must make a factual claim, that is, state that something is the case, just say something is a fact, might not be a fact, and make an inference from those facts. So the terminology we use, if something is just stated with no support whatsoever, just claimed as a fact, that's called a premise. And then the conclusion is marked off as, I like that phrase, marked off as following from the premises. And in the optional videos, but also here, the reason we have to use that kind of language, you can't say the conclusion follows from the premises, because not all conclusions follow from premises. There are bad inferences. And so the conclusion is intended as following from the premises. And so, first of all, make sure that you're able to spot premises versus conclusion. A lot of times in writings, just if you pick up a normal non-textbook book, the conclusion will be first, whereas in logic, the conclusion is just about always last. So make sure you're spotting the conclusion. How do we do this? I always like to think in terms of support. The premises are given no support at all, but they do the supporting. The conclusion is supported. So to go back to that simple argument I gave that Ulrich Gustason give as well, all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. Consider only those words, nothing else, that you know about the world. If I just say that argument, are you given any reason to think that all men are mortal? No, it's just stated for acceptance or rejection. Are you given any reason to think Socrates is a man? No, it's just stated for acceptance or rejection. Are you given any reason to think Socrates is mortal? Yes, it follows from the previous two. And so if you're having trouble spotting premises versus conclusion, always think in terms of supporting versus supported. Premises do the supporting, as such they themselves are not supported. The conclusion is supported or at least intended to be. When we do this, the authors rightly talk about there's an important distinction between deduction and induction. I've already mentioned that in the previous video. We deal almost exclusively with deduction in this course. Induction is more for the critical thinking and informal logic. Deduction are the ones that follow with, or the conclusion is marked off as following with certainty. What kind of things follow from certainty? The things that are basically true by definition or true by form. So the example I just gave is deductive because it just follows from the meaning of all know some. And so it just follows from the meaning of the words. Other types of deductive arguments, arguments from math, several of the examples in the textbook about if-thens. If you're in Ohio, you're in the U.S. I'm not in the U.S. It follows that I'm not in Ohio. Those kind of things are deductive as well. Notice they're not really how normal people talk. But that's deduction. And again, if that's fast, check out the optional deduction versus induction video after you've done the reading and seen what Ulrich and Gustason say about it. The terms valid and sound, which they focus on there, only apply to deduction, technically. So a valid, so remember, every argument does two things. Claims something's a fact, makes an inference. So if the inference is good, you know what, let me pause there, I should say. As such, every argument has two evaluations. We evaluate the inference and we evaluate the facts. Those are separate. If the inference is good, we call it valid. What does valid mean? Roughly, the conclusion follows from the premises. So that's it. Notice it doesn't say the premises are true. It just says the conclusion follows from the premises. One example I like to use a lot, well, here's an inference. Mickey is over 12 feet tall, therefore Mickey is over 10 feet tall. Notice, that is a really good example of a valid argument because because the conclusion follows from the premise. Notice it doesn't matter whether I'm over 12 feet tall or not. The conclusion follows from the premise. And so validity, inference, logic is independent of the facts. We're talking about inference. And so very, very generally, to determine validity, you would just say something like, assuming all premises were true, would the conclusion follow? More precisely, the definition of valid given in the textbook is one in which it is impossible for all premises to be true and the conclusion false. That doesn't say the premises are true. That doesn't say the conclusion is false. That says something about their relationship, that when the premises are true, so is the conclusion. So that's validity. That's only about the inference. But that's not enough to convince you. You shouldn't believe Mickey Lurkowski's over 10 feet tall. Why? Because he's not over 12 feet tall. So so valid is not enough. Instead, we want a sound argument. A sound argument, the precise definition, is simply a valid argument with all true premises. But remember, in a valid argument, true premises guarantee a true conclusion. So, if it's a valid argument with all true premises, the conclusion is also guaranteed as true. We should accept the conclusions of sound arguments and only sound arguments, because sound arguments are the ones that did both things right. And I do want to emphasize there, kind of a rookie mistake thing. People think that valid applies to the inference, therefore sound applies to the content, whether the premises are true or not. No, sound is the final evaluation of the argument. It is the inference and true premises. So if an argument just has true premises but is invalid, it is not sound. So Mickey is over 6 feet tall. That's true. Therefore, space aliens have just landed in the front yard. Well, no, that's not a good inference. And it doesn't matter that the premises are true because the inference is bad. We should not accept the conclusion. So, sound arguments are good arguments, but to be good arguments, they must do two things right. They must provide a good inference, that is, be valid, and they must have all true premises. So just to make really sure you're on, so very common to have trouble separating out those things. And so the first of the weekly exercises is just going to ask you to do that. Give an argument that has good inference, good content, bad inference, bad content, and the other combinations. All right, that's all we have to say about 1.1. The other part of this lecture is 1.2. And what we're doing here, well, we have all these arguments in real life with words and things. How do we go from that to formal construction and evaluation? We need to convert this into our general notions into something much more precise. Basically, adopt a logical language, and 1.2 is really going to start doing that. So first of all, we have to switch from language to something quantifiable and measurable. And of course, we do this with sentences. All of these arguments are built of sentences. Actually, they're a specific type of sentence called a statement. Not all sentences are statements. Statements are basically sentences with truth values. That is, a statement is something that can be true or false. So Mickey is over 6 feet tall is a statement. Mickey is a fire-breathing lizard is a statement. It's a false statement. So the kind of sentences that can be true or false are statements. Statements have what are called truth value. Not all sentences have truth value. Ulrich Gustason didn't talk much about this, but things like exclamations and questions don't actually have truth values. But all the stuff we use in arguments do. So we tend to think of arguments as being composed of statements that are true or false. That's great. But one thing it's important to realize, whenever we're in logic, we can talk about interpreted and uninterpreted. So we could just as easily just call a statement T or F, and that's actually enough to do the operations we want to do. For instance, your computer doesn't know what the heck true means or what the heck false means. They use 1 and 0. So if we are interpreting the truth value of these statements, then we're talking about true and false. But just be aware, we don't have to do that at all. We can do our entire syntax without any semantics. So that's statements, and of course, all the stuff we use in arguments, premises, and conclusions will be statements with truth values. However, we need to make a distinction between simple and compound. There's a lot of ways to do this. First of all, it in some ways mimics what you've learned in your English and language classes. But very broadly speaking, I think the most helpful way to think of it is a compound statement has multiple things that can be true or false. A simple statement has only one thing that can be true or false. So, Mickey is over 6 feet tall. Simple. Mickey is over 6 feet tall and bald. Compound. Why? Because there's two things there that we need to analyze whether they're true or false. Whether Mickey is over 6 feet tall and whether Mickey is bald. That's the very basic difference. What's happening with the truth values. And the reason I like to put it that way is the one very important operator that we're going to talk about that makes a statement compound is the word not, is a negation. If I say Mickey is not over 6 feet tall, there's actually two things that could be true or false there. Is it true or false that Mickey is over 6 feet tall? Is it true or false that it is not the case that Mickey is over 6 feet tall? And so the word not makes a statement compound just as surely as the word and does. And so that's why we look at these things that can't be broken down any farther and that therefore only have one possible truth value assigned to them. So that's simple versus compound. I know that's a little fast, and that's one that you really want to be careful to walk through because we will need that later. I don't, that there's only so much you can say about it before you just have to start practicing. So, next one we should talk about here is, oh, sorry, and by the way, if you're ever having more trouble with things like that, if you say, boy, uh, you know, the simple and compound distinction, I don't think the book says enough about it, and I just don't get it. That's what the questions about materials discussion boards are for. So each week you will have a discussion board that has the weekly exercises, but then there'll also be another discussion board that just is questions about the material. Those questions go directly to me. So if you want to say something like, can you say some more about the simple versus compound distinction, or can you give me some examples that I can figure out are simple or compound? That's what those are for, and you are welcome and encouraged to use those. All right. Now we finally get to the sentential connectives. So these are sometimes called operators, um, but they do things with statements. One of the things I really like about the Ulrich Gustason textbook is they distinguish between. Sorry, not distinguish. They always separate. And we only ever do half the operators at once. Most textbooks will give you all 6 at the same time, whereas Ulrich Gustason very helpfully divides them in half. So we're going to do just the first 3 operators and do some things with them. And we'll see that in later chapters of the book too. So what are these 3 operators? In ordinary language that is interpreted, they're and, or, and not. In what do they do? The and is called a conjunction. It conjoins 2 statements. The or is called a disjunction. It disjoins 2 statements. And the not is called a negation. It negates 1 statement. So first and foremost, note and does 2 things. Works with 2 things. Or works with two things, 2 statements. Not works with 1. For conjunctions, the 2 things that are being conjoined are called conjuncts. For disjunctions, they are called disjuncts. So, and, or, and not would make a statement compound. So, the next thing that is asked in your weekly exercises are just to do some examples that are clearly true or clearly false. They somewhat mimic ordinary language. So, Mickey is over 6 feet tall and bald. True. Mickey is over 6 feet tall and a fire-breathing lizard. False. What we'll find is that conjunctions are only true when both of the things they're conjoining are also true. By contrast, disjunction is or. So if you say, Mickey is over 6 feet tall or a fire-breathing lizard, that's true because it just needs one to be true. Having said that, let's introduce one last and final hiccup. There's a very important logical distinction between exclusive and non-exclusive disjunctions. A lot of textbooks say exclusive and inclusive, so I'll probably slip and say that once in a while. What's the difference here? When we're talking about disjunctions, does both make it true? So, I mean, I guess that's it, but how does this come up in ordinary language? The best and clearest distinction, I think, is just to insert the word either. If you want an exclusive disjunction, that is where both cannot be true, you use either or. Mickey is either bald or not. Not going to both be true. Mickey is either a professor or the student. Not both going to be true. Inclusive ors, both are still true. So, is Mickey a professor or a doctor? Well, yes. He has both, and so if somebody asks that, you'd probably say yes. So, inclusive or, when both disjuncts are true, the disjunction is true. Exclusive or can't have both true disjuncts. So if both are true, you would consider the whole disjunction false. One last little bit here when we're talking about negations. What does negation do to the truth value? It just flips it. So if you negate something true, it's false, and if you negate something false, it's true. That's how we operate. That's why these are called operators. So if you say Mickey is over 6 feet tall, that's true, which means if you negate it, if you say Mickey is not over 6 feet tall, that's false. By contrast, if you say Mickey is a fire-breathing lizard, that's false. And if you say Mickey is not a fire-breathing lizard, that's true. By the way, I've been using these connectives just in ordinary language senses. There's very often a lot of ways to express them. For instance, instead of saying Mickey is not, you could say it is not the case that Mickey is. It is not the case that Mickey is a fire-breathing lizard. That might be a more preferable way to say it, just for reasons we'll see as we get further into the course. Last thing that 1.2 does is it introduces the notion of a contradictory. So first of all, contradictory is a relation between two statements. A pair of contradictories is such that if one is false, the other must be true, and vice versa. So Mickey is over 6 feet tall, and Mickey is not over 6 feet tall, is a contradictory. Bruiser is a dog, Bruiser is not a dog, contradictory. One or the other has to be true. So negations, negating something turns it into a contradictory. But notice contradictories also have an important relationship with exclusive disjunctions. So when the two disjuncts are contradictories, then we have an exclusive disjunct. So Bruiser is either a dog or not a dog. It is a true exclusive disjunct. I think I've said enough for now. Again, what are we doing with this video? This is the introduction to the readings. Go do the readings. Go do the exercises in the book, which are not collected. Then go do the exercises which are collected that are presented on the discussion boards for the weekly discussions. And if you have some questions, don't submit your weekly exercises yet. Ask them in the question discussion board so that you might see the answer before you have to do what's graded. Otherwise, we will see you next time.